back. This is our week 5 presentation in which we are going to be looking at the topic of poverty. Now this is just to show us some statistics. So in 2019, basically there was kind of a bunch of research done into the hourly minimum wage. This was in April of last year. So you can kind of see in all the different provinces what the minimum hourly wage rate was for basically most kind of entry level sorts of jobs. So you can see British Columbia was $13.85. Now that changes for a variety of different reasons, but this is just to kind of show us kind of what it's like across Canada. So the first thing that we want to kind of also mention is the concept of privilege, which is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available to a particular group or person. Now this is really important because oftentimes when we think about poverty, we think about people who have lost their jobs or can't get a job due to whatever circumstances. But it's also important to note that a lot of us were born into a place of privilege, a place where we benefit from society and the things that have been kind of put in place. I definitely benefit from the fact that both my parents come from kind of families that, even though they weren't super well off, still did quite well. All of my sisters and I did post-secondary education to some capacity. Our parents supported us through that financially. So that's something that a lot of us have to think about when we talk about things such as privilege. So this right here is just a link to a video that you can kind of watch on your own. And it basically kind of talks about what's happening in the world, how minimum wage has changed kind of throughout the decades. It's a really interesting video and it'll be linked in the description. So when we define poverty, we have to ask ourselves a couple questions. What does it mean to actually be poor? And what are the characteristics? So it's actually really hard to define poverty because it's kind of different in each country. But one kind of way is the extent in which an individual does without resources such as financial resources, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical support systems, relationships, role models. All of those in a way that there's a discrepancy between people who have those things and people who do not. So a couple things to think about when we're talking about poverty. Many economics actually disagree how they should determine who is poor and what needs to be done to reduce poverty. There's a lot of kind of arguments of kind of the whole concept of defining quote unquote poor. It's also important to note that poverty is relative and that the economic class is continuously changing. There's no clear distinction. Also, there's a difference between generational poverty and situational poverty. They are completely different. We talk about generational poverty, we're talking about families who, due to the system, have not been able to get ahead. And so they have children, and those children come into a system that is not supporting them, and they're not able to break out of that cycle. So they also continue to live in poverty, and then their children, and so on and so forth. Situational poverty is, well, if you think about kind of what's happening right now, losing your job, like just out of the blue, due to, I don't know, a world epidemic. You suddenly lose your job and do not have the means to look after your family. That's a situation. That's not generations upon generations of your family. So here are some of the causes that might be attributed to causing poverty. Things like lack of education, natural disasters, lack of money, greed, no opportunities provided, overpopulation, addiction, and abuse. Now this isn't all of them, and all of these we could unpack kind of each separate thing and kind of talk about, but it's more just thinking about that when we think about poverty, there are lots and lots of factors. It's not just not having money, it's more than that. So when we look at this chart right here, this is the World Wealth Levels-ish from 2013. So you can kind of see which countries are kind of quote unquote well off and which of those struggle in terms of wealth levels. So you can obviously see North America, Europe, Australia, Japan. You can see those nations are usually the ones that we think of as developed nations, ones that there's lots of wealth and economy, even if it happens to be in the hands of the few. But You can kind of see that. And then as we get kind of the different colors, you can see in a lot of places kind of on the continent of Africa. If you look into places like India, it's just really interesting because when we look at it this way, this is only looking at money. This isn't necessarily looking at food, which is why I wanted to show you guys this chart. So this is from the World Food Program, and this was from 2019. I actually have the PDF version of this, so I'll link it in the description. So you can kind of see, whereas the other one had to do with wealth, this one has to do with food. So it kind of shows the different places. You can see there's kind of some similarities between the two, but there's also some differences. You'll notice that places such as India, China, and things like that do have struggles with populations who do not have enough food. And things like that. Obviously, it's very interesting as well because you can see Canada and the United States that's less of a thing. And again, this is all relative to looking at this as a whole. This isn't taking into account certain exceptions or certain groups within some of those maybe blue countries. So then we have the definition of absolute poverty. This is a state of utter destitution. This means you basically have nothing. And this is very, very extreme. Oftentimes you're seeing these in very kind of underdeveloped nations, either due to corrupt governments or natural disasters and things like that. Now this type of kind of poverty oftentimes doesn't exist in Canada because Canada does have social welfare systems put into place to prevent people from getting to that. We still have poverty in Canada, but it's not to the extreme as maybe some other countries. So with relative poverty, this is essentially where, for instance, for the example, Canadians who don't necessarily lack the basic food, safe water, shelter, or clothing, this is oftentimes relative to other families within Canada. So as we see, we don't necessarily have absolute poverty, but there's definitely relative poverty based on comparing certain Canadian families or people to kind of other groups. So if we think about, say, for instance, the middle class, which most of us fall into, we obviously then compare ourselves to, okay, so if we are in the middle class, those who have less than we do kind of are in comparison to being quote unquote poor. So there's an interesting kind of term, and it's the low income cutoff. So this was actually developed by Stats Canada in 1968. And basically what it was used to do is to look at households that are being classified with limited income situations. So for whatever reason, those families just do not make or have enough money to necessarily support everything within what they need. So the low income cutoff is kind of interesting because it allows the system to decide who should be getting support and who shouldn't based on the amount of money made. So what it's essentially looking at, you can see the statistic here, that it would show the size of a family unit and how much that person necessarily needs in order to kind of be able to do okay. So it basically looked at some statistics and kind of looked at that the average Canadian household spends about 35% before tax income, food, clothing, and shelter. It was interesting to note that a lot of households that were quote unquote relatively worse off spent more than 20% above the national average on 3 necessities. So that meant that those families oftentimes had less income, which meant they were spending more of the amount of money that they were making on food, clothing, and shelter. So you can kind of see the minimum necessary income needed to support essentially a single person, 2 people, and so on. And oftentimes this kind of cutoff is often used by analysts as indications of poverty. However, it's really important to note that sometimes the media likes to refer to this as the poverty line. But the thing is there's no actual recognition of this status. Stats Canada doesn't really promote it being used in that way, because oftentimes when we say poverty line, that can mean something different for different nations and whatnot. So Stats Canada is like, okay, we just call it essentially the income cutoff. And the thing is that number is constantly changing as inflation, the economy changes, goes up and down. Oh my goodness, I can't even think of what it is, what it's like right now. Man, it must be very, very interesting. Poor Stats Canada. So when we think of quote unquote types of poor, there's kind of the different groups. There's the working poor and the welfare poor. So the working poor is oftentimes people who work, but their wages do not keep them out of poverty. This could be for things like absence of union, market power of employers, or the fact that they live in, say, Vancouver, where it's so expensive to be able to live there that the person isn't making enough to actually support themselves. Then there's things like the welfare poor. So these are people who aren't working and experiencing poverty, oftentimes in a marginalized group, those with poor health, the elderly, single parents, job loss. So a lot of those kind of issues arise for people where they have to seek out other sources of income because they're not able to make the money themselves. So it's really important when we talk about welfare, not everybody necessarily can just get a welfare check. That seems to be one of the kind of big stigmas, is that, oh, you could just go on welfare and just get a welfare check. It's a lot more complicated than that. You can actually look at filing for welfare, and it is quite a large document. I know this because when I worked for a summer at the Salvation Army, there was a lot of people who were struggling to be able to support their families and had to use outside sources, not just the money they were getting from welfare. So in a welfare state, this was kind of in the early 20th century, Canada established this. And the whole philosophy behind it is that government should be using social programs and transfers financed out of taxation to help people who are disadvantaged, which makes sense, that people who can afford to pay their taxes because they make a great amount of money should obviously be putting into a system so that everyone can kind of benefit. Now, when we look at kind of tackling the issue of poverty, there are oftentimes programs that are essentially meant to deal with poverty as an issue. There are structural strategies and relief strategies. So in structural strategies, these are attempting to eliminate the cause of poverty long term. So an example of that could be creating, say, affordable housing in an entire city. So lowering the amount in which everyone has to pay for rent. And that's a long-term thing because that's benefiting everybody. It's not just a single band-aid, oh, we're just helping this one group. It's helping everybody. Relief strategies tend to be things like immediate support, food banks, government transfers, things like that, doing a one-time sort of oh, we're going to give this, say, this family like a check. It's only a one-time thing. Oftentimes, these are criticized as band-aid solutions. Now, it's important to note that relief strategies are important. If we did not have those in place, a lot of people would be struggling. Say, for instance, if there was flooding or a fire, if we didn't have these relief strategies in place, a lot of those people would just be out of house and home. They are important, but they're not necessarily going to sustain for, well, forever, because there has to be food in those food banks. You have to have the money to do that. So oftentimes relief strategies are put into place to kind of supplement people until a structural strategy can be put into place. So kind of some last thoughts, a couple things to think about with poverty. There definitely are preconditions for success. That comes out of that whole concept of privilege. And a lot of us benefit from the system already. It's also important to note that poverty is a barrier to social mobility. It's really hard to break the system if the system is already not supporting you. So oftentimes that whole generational poverty, it's very hard to break that. And a lot of people you see all those happy-go-lucky movies of people like The Pursuit of Happiness, where it's a single parent struggling to kind of survive. And it's important to note that while some people are able to rise above, not everybody is, and that's important to acknowledge. It's also important to note that the poor people are just lazy. There definitely are some people that, for whatever, struggle with poverty, but oftentimes, if you don't know a person's situation, it's not a place to judge. Also, it's important to note that the systems in place don't always work. We know that. We know the fact that not every system put in place is flawless, and there are issues. We get human error or structural error all the time. You guys also know that the gap between the rich and the poor is absolutely growing, and we can see that right now, even in terms of, say, for instance, for testing for COVID-19, that it seems that definitely a lot of the rich can kind of sort of benefit from the fact that they can get testing quickly and easily, the fact that they can live in kind of their lovely mansions and tweet out about, oh, we're all in this together. I saw a really amazing quote that I actually put on my Twitter that says, all of us are in the same storm, but not all of us are in the same boat. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. It's also interesting to note that lots of people argue, and I actually agree with this, that poverty is man-made. The fact that if we as an entire society decided that the rich have to stop basically getting richer, cut them off, and that the rest of that money went into social programs, I think we could eliminate poverty. But the problem is you have to get everybody on board to do that. So that's just kind of some last thoughts on poverty. So for your assignment this week, what you're going to be doing is looking at what it's like to live on your own. So essentially what this assignment is it's kind of sort of looking at what it is like to live on your own. Now, this isn't a perfect chart. I did a lot of fiddling with it, and it's not the greatest thing, but it just gives you a bit of a sense of kind of what it is like to live on your own, to support not just yourself, but if you have other members of the family and things like that. So what you're going to be doing is kind of three sort of tasks: comparing the cost of apartments and houses in Prince Rupert to those in, say, Vancouver, Victoria, or somewhere else, the cost of a car loan and payments, and calculating the cost of food and additional items. Now, it's really important to think about some of these things. Now, I know some of you don't necessarily have a car, or you could work on your own vehicle. Just fill in the chart to the best of your capabilities. If you have questions, please contact me. So after you fill in the chart and put in all your information, these are the questions afterwards. Just answer them pretty much like they can be after the assignment on the same Word document, or you could put them on a separate piece of paper, whatever you end up deciding. So these are the things I want you to think about. So you have to answer these. So calculate how much money you would have if you only worked 40 hours a week for $13 an hour. So calculate that. So how much money that would be, and then subtract per week how much money you have left over. If you have some, great, but what are some things that maybe you would want to cut from your budget? It's also important to note that for this assignment, I want you to assume that this is regular, we're not in quarantine at the moment, and you still have all your regular schedules. So if you have hockey or basketball or dance, if you have other things that you do, or band, you have to pay for those. So make sure this is not I have my own garden and I raise my own animals. Yeah, I know none of you do that. So you want this to be kind of realistically kind of you right now, just to think about. Okay, then the next part is, what was the one thing that really stood out to you from this assignment? Maybe there was a cost that you're like, oh my gosh, that's so much, or you're like, oh, actually, I could probably live on my own. And this last one is just thinking kind of throughout all of this, what might be the biggest impact of cost on someone who does not have a stable income? What's the thing that's probably going to hit them the hardest? So if you guys have any questions on this assignment, feel free to shoot me an email or a text, or come and join me for the office hours. All right, good luck.